Prior to creating any item numbers within Acclamare, you must first define units of measure. Units of measure are the English keys by which items are identified for their SKU unit of measure, quantity unit of measure, and price cost unit of measure. These are applicable to both the sales side and the purchasing side. You will define the units of measure under the File Maintenance menu, Inventory, and Units of Measure. In this screen, you're identifying the English keywords by which you'll identify units of measure. You are not assigning any conversion ratios at this point. After you begin using Acclamare, if you find that you need additional units of measure, you can come back to the screen and add them. This screen includes only two columns. One is the unit of measure, the other is the description. The important column here is the unit of measure. This will be the value to which all other conversion ratios are based to. As you'll see later on in this presentation, it will be very important that you do not edit the unit of measure values in this column here. So if we have BX at the present time, and we have created other ratios that reference this, if we were to come in here and edit this to BOX instead, we will have now lost all of the ratios that we have previously defined. So keep in mind that you do not want to edit these values once you have created them in this screen. Now let's move on to the Item File Maintenance area, which is where the units of measure are most prominently defined. Okay, in this case we're going to bring up a test item here to go over a few concepts that we need to recognize. Let's draw our attention to the SKU unit of measure field. This would be the most important field when we consider how we're going to set up this item with its pricing and costing units of measure. Let's review some best practices when deciding what SKU unit of measure will be used. SKU unit of measure is the base unit for this item. All other units of measure that are defined for this item will be some conversion ratio factor of this base SKU. This means that an item that is defined as an inch in the SKU can be sold or priced as feet yard, per 100 feet, per 1,000 feet. A key factor and common mistake is that you do not want to make your decision upon the SKU based upon how you expect or desire to sell or purchase this item. There are other fields specifically for that purpose. You will want to set the SKU to the absolute smallest quantity value that you could conceivably sell or consume this item in, and consumption also includes how you possibly would define this as a component of a kit order. The goal is that you never want to have to create another unit of measure that is a fractional value of the SKU. In other words, all additional units of measure should be some value of 1 or greater compared to the SKU. When fractional values are used to create additional SKUs, this can lead to pricing issues in the sales order process and in the purchasing side. Using fractional units of measure within kit orders can have many different problems, including commitment quantities and how price roll-up is calculated. So the item that we see on screen has a SKU unit of measure of each. It also has a quantity unit measure of each, and its conversion ratio is 1, meaning 1 each of the SKU makes up 1 each of the quantity unit of measure. It is important to recognize that anywhere within Acclamare, whether that be a processing screen or a maintenance screen, that whenever you see a quantity being displayed, it is always looking at the quantity unit of measure or some other alternate unit of measure. You're never actually seeing the SKU unit of measure being displayed on screen. There is one exception to that, and that is when you do an item lookup. Before we take a look of unit of measures within item lookups, let's first create some quantity unit of measure and price cost unit of measures that are different from the skew. So let's say that the common method of selling this item is in a pack which is comprised of 4 each. What we would do, we'd come to the quantity unit of measure field. We're going to scroll down to the available units of measures that we had defined, and we choose pack. And now we move down to the next field and we set how many eaches or skews are in a pack. We'll set this to 4.0. We now have the option of defining how we're going to be selling this item. Will we be selling it in the each, or will we be selling it via the pack? If we want to sell it in the pack, we're going to change the price cost unit of measure and the ratio. I want you to please note that in the list price for this item, it presently says $40.20. Now let's change this unit of measure to pack, and we're going to change this unit of measure ratio to 4. And notice that the system has automatically changed the list price to be 4 times what it was per SKU. It now is showing as $160. Now let's perform a lookup of the same item. You'll notice in the screen that we have columns called on hand, and in parentheses we have the letter S representing SKU. I've also included the column called SKU and the on hand with a Q in it representing the quantity unit of measure, and we've also included the column called quantity. So in this case we're seeing that there's 37 eaches on hand, or 9.25 packs. Right-clicking on any of the column headers and choosing Column Chooser will display a list of values that we can put into this grid. Notice we can show availability in either Q, meaning quantity unit measure, or in the base SKU unit measure. These are available in many of the quantity and pricing fields that's available in this grid. The value for quantity unit of measure as well as price cost unit of measure will be the default values that are used throughout many sales screens, including maintenance areas such as quantity adjustments, defining customer contract pricing, and areas such as that. You have the ability to set up additional units of measure, and that was found under the maintenance menu under units of measure. Let's say that for this item we also have the desire to sell this by the pair. We click new. We'd see if we have already predefined pair in our list, which we have, and now we'd set our unit of measure ratio to 2 each. Now you'll be able to have both pack, pair, and each as available options when selling this item. If you will be defining any customer item number or item cross-references for customers, you can also define what the default pricing and quantity unit of measures will be for that customer. From the Item File Maintenance screen, select Maintenance Customer Item, and it will display a list of the customers for which you have defined cross-references. This screen is also where you would be able to add cross-references, as well as you can do this from the Customer File Maintenance. In this grid, right-click on a column header to display the column chooser. You'll see that you have 2 additional fields here, unit of measure pricing and unit of measure quantity. This will display the units of measure that will be used when this item is sold using this customer's item number as a cross-reference. We can change these values by selecting into one of the unit measure boxes, clicking the drop-down box, which will bring up a list of all of the units of measures that are defined for this item. If we wish to sell this item in quantities based upon pack, we can see here that we have 1 pack equals 4 eaches. The source of this unit of measure conversion came from the item quantity unit of measure, whereas we also had created one called a pair, and that was in the item file maintenance under alternate units of measure. Let's set this to pair, and we also want to change its its quantity to pair as well. So now whenever this item is pulled up as a customer item number, it will appear on their sales order or quote or invoice via pair as opposed to each. Now let's take a look at how we can manage units of measure on the vendor or purchasing side. In file maintenance, we'll go to vendor, which will bring up the vendor record for this item. Again, these units of measure that we're going to define are specifically for individual vendors in the screen. So this one is HYL42, and it will have units of measure for it. If we had multiple vendors established here, each vendor can have their own unique quantity unit of measure and cost unit of measure ratios. Another area impacted by units of measure is the selling price brackets. Please note that this item has a SKU unit of measure of each and a quantity unit measure of pack, as well as a selling unit of measure of pack. This bracket type is set up as a quantity based with fixed pricing. From the maintenance menu, we'll select brackets. We'll add a new bracket. So notice the headers here are referencing the unit of measure based upon pack in both the pricing and the quantity. So what I'm specifying here is that when I reach a quantity of 2 packs, which is going to be 8 each, they're going to be receiving a price per pack of $50. We'll include this at 5 packs at $47. So in this case, the pack quantity of 5 and the ratio at 4 in the item file maintenance screen means that when they get to 8 each and 20 each is where the price bracket comes into effect. It will not be necessary for the sales order that is being processed to be selling the item in pack. That could be sold in each, pack, pair, or whatever other units of measure have been defined for the customer. The important part to know here is that everything goes back to the base SKU. So in this screen we're referencing PK, so 2 PK is equal to 8 each. In a sales order screen, even if that is set up to pair or dozen or whatever, it still converts back to the base unit of measure of each. Another file maintenance area which has an impact upon which SKUs are being used is when you're defining the kitting for an item. Although it's not intuitive to the user as to what unit of measure the finished kit is referring to, what it is referring to is each. So what we're specifying here is how many components of a particular item will be required to make up a single each of the item. So in this case, 1 each of item CMC10 is required to make 1 each of the finished item. So let's play a scenario here where we have this defined as 1 each is making up a SKU quantity unit of measure of 1 each. I'm going to close the screen down and save our settings. Now notice that our default quantity unit of measure is pack, which has a ratio of 4 each. Let's go out into the transactional area and create a kit order. We're going to put in the item that we have predefined. Now notice what the quantity is. It has the unit of measure being PK. It has the quantity being 4 because 1 PK is equal to 4 each. And notice that our unit of measure is 4 each on the component. That is correct because we had defined 1 each of the component would equal 1 each of the finished good. However, the default unit of measure for this is pack, which has a ratio of 4 to 1. Let's delete this kit order and make a change to this. We're going to go back to the item file maintenance for this item, and we're going to change back its default unit of measure to each. And we'll go ahead and change the price cost back to each as well. And we'll save our settings. We do not have to make any change of the setting in the kit component definition because it was originally set to be compared to the SKU unit of measure of 1 each. However, now let's go take a look at our kit order itself and see what changes we can make to that. So now we'll enter new. We'll put in our item number. Notice that the unit of measure default is 1 each. The quantity defaulted to 1 each. and the component ratio is properly set at 1 each of the component equals 1 each of the SKU. Now let's take a look at the vendor item record for this item. From the maintenance menu, we'll select vendors. And in this example, we have one vendor established for this item. It's vendor HYL42. If we had multiple vendors for this item, they would all be listed in this upper grid. When a vendor is selected in the upper grid, the information in the grid below is specific to that vendor. So vendor HYL42 could be purchased in units of measure based upon each, while vendor XYZ could be purchased in other quantities such as pack, pair, dozen, or whatever we define for that vendor. Just as in the item file maintenance screen, we're able to define what the units of measure will be for the vendor, and those can be comprised of the units of measure that we defined. And there I'm referring to the English keys. So in this case, we can say that we would like to purchase this from the vendor in cases, and a case is equal to 144 each. And we can also define, is this going to be price per each, per case? And we'll go ahead with a case here as well and set 144. Now that's going to be the default units of measure used when purchased from this vendor. For this vendor, we can also set up alternate units of measure. These are different from the alternate units of measure that we defined at the item file maintenance. So here we're going to say that we can also base this upon carton quantities, which has a value of 12 as a conversion ratio, and they can have multiple units of measure. What this provides you is the ability that when you're entering a purchase order, that this item can be purchased from this vendor as a default of case. You'd also have available the units of measure SKU of each, as well as carton. Let's take a look at a couple other features that's happening within the screen. I'm going to begin by setting this back to each, which was how the default appeared. So each with a ratio of 1, and we'll do the same for the pricing here, if I can select the correct one. 1. Okay, so now we're back to base SKU of each. Now notice the minimum purchase that appears in the screen is 1 each. So 1 SKU is the minimum from this vendor. Now let's say that we are going to be purchasing this in cases, which has a ratio of 144. We'll use cases here as well for 144. Now notice that the system automatically changed the minimum purchase to 0.0069, which is what the ratio is to 1 each. Most likely, if you're buying this by the case from the vendor, they're going to require potentially a minimum purchase of 1 case. So I'm actually going to go up here and alter this to be 1 case minimum. And also notice the distributor's cost is now $23.95, $2,395 per case. That did the automatic conversion from what the each was. Now also, I'm going to change this back to each just to have you see what happens to these other values here. Now notice the minimum purchase when I move out of this field is going to change back to 144. And we'll change this back to each as well. So quantity of 1, the $2,395 will now change to $21 per each. So all these stay consistent. Just want to make a reminder that when you do change a quantity unit of measure to some other value, you'll most likely want to change the minimum purchase to be representative of the unit of measure in which you'll be purchasing this item in. Let's now take a look at the vendor cost brackets for this item. So when you're using bracket-based pricing for an item, you need to set a selection up here for bracket type. So let's review those for a moment. When bracket type is set to none, you're specifying that you're only going to use the price that's shown below, and notice that its name is called distributor cost. In other words, you're buying this at a fixed price from the vendor without any reference to a quantity discount or a quantity fixed price based upon the quantity that you're purchasing. In other words, this is a fixed value, whereas if we change the bracket type to be discount percentage, notice that when we tab out of that field, the name of this goes to vendor list price. So when it's set to discount percent or cost, what you're saying to the system is use the pricing controls that's in the bracket area at the bottom, and use either a discount percent or a cost for that. In defining the bracket quantities, this will always be used and based upon the SKU unit of measure of the item. It has no reference to the quantity unit of measure that's defined for the vendor. So in this case, we'll leave this as the quantity unit measure is 1 each. And down here we're going to define that the quantity brackets is that when you buy one of these items, you're receiving no discount. When you buy 200 of them, you're getting a 10% discount. So in this grid, it doesn't matter whether I change this to back to a case of being 144. Everything down here still stays the same in the bracket. This bracket quantity is always referencing the unit of measure defined as the SKU. So in this case, 1 each, 200 each. So let's take this back to unit of measure of each of 1, and let's do a replenishment for this item and see what it comes out to be. So keep in mind, purchasing quantity of 1 has no discount. A purchasing quantity of 200 gets a 10% discount, and our current vendor list price is $21 per each. I have gone ahead and created a replenishment that will include the item that we have been working with. So notice that within this item it says we need to purchase, or at least suggest that we purchase 88 each. And our units of measure for this item, the quantity unit of measure, again this is the vendor quantity unit of measure, is in each, which is what we left that at the last time we were in vendor item maintenance. So if I am going to purchase 1 each of these, it remains at $21. That is in line with what our bracket was. Our bracket said that at a quantity of 1 we received 0 discount. At a quantity of 200 we received I believe it was a 10% discount. So if I change my quantity here to 190, the cost is still $21 per each. If I change it to 210, now our cost reflects the 10% discount. So you'll notice that in this case the replenishment is set to each, and it is being evaluated in the bracket quantity as each. Next, I'm going to go back and change the units of measure in the vendor item record and see what the results are then. So here we are back at the item maintenance area for this item. We'll go into the vendor screen, and we're going to make some changes here that say that the default purchasing units of this is going to be cases, which is 144. Our pricing is going to be based upon cases. And just for simplicity here, we'll also say that the minimum purchase quantity is 1 case. So you'll notice that our list price of this item has increased by a magnitude of 3,025. In the bracket area down at the bottom, we're still set at 1 and 200. Keep in mind, these are reflective of the SKU units of measure set at the item file maintenance area. We'll go ahead and shut this down, and I will rerun replenishment, and I'll be right back and show you that screen next. Okay, so here we're back to a replenishment that was built after I had made the change in the vendor item record from eaches to case. So you'll notice for this item here that the suggested quantity is still being reflected in the SKU of each. However, it does say that in the unit of measure that we'll be purchasing, I messed up my scrolling there, our unit of measure is going to be cases as well as a cost is in case. Now remember, we had set that at 1 each there would be no discount. So if I change my quantity to 1 each, you'll notice that the quantity still remains at $3,000 per case. Our unit of measure conversion was 1 case equals 144 each. And our bracket was set that at 200 each we get a discount. So if I set this to 2 cases, I'm actually buying 288 each. Therefore, our discount should be reflective of that, and it does give us a 10% discount rate at this level. I have gone ahead and set the vendor item record back to each as its default values, and let's take a look at the purchasing side. If we go into direct purchase order entry, we'll create a new purchase order for this vendor. And we'll go ahead and enter in our item number that we wish to sell here. Now notice purchase order screen always defaults to a quantity of one each, and in this case one each corresponds to a price or cost of $21 per each, as that is where we're at in our quantity bracket. Now if I change this to quantity to 190, you'll notice that our cost remains at that. If I go at 200 or above, we'll see that the price now reflects the 10% discount that's applicable to this item. During purchase order entry, if you wish to alter the units by which you want to sell an item, you can click the ellipsis icon and say, I really want to sell this in the other available units of measure that's for this item, which we had established as pair and carton as well. I'm going to enlarge my column width here a little bit so we can take a look at what happens when we alter some of these values here. So you'll see that under the unit of measure column, it has a Q after it. That means that what's being represented in the quantity field is eaches, and that is based upon what the quantity unit of measure is for that vendor item record. Similarly, we're using the cost unit of measure that's defined at the vendor level here. If I go in here and say I want to change my units of measure that I'm purchasing it for, and remember we have pair and carton also created here, so I'm going to change this to carton. So there's 12 each per carton. Click OK. You'll notice that changes to carton and the quantity changes to 16.66. Notice nothing has actually changed for the cost that we're purchasing this at. That's because it's still being referenced to eaches. If I wish to keep this cost unit of measure in line with the carton quantity that I'm purchasing it in, I would want to also change this to carton. Click OK. And now it has changed the price, so now we're buying 16 cartons at $226 per carton. Let's now take a look at the selling side of an item. Now we're going to go back to the item file maintenance, and presently this is set up as Skew of each, as well as the quantity unit measure of each, and a price cost unit measure of one each. Let's change this so that we are editing this to a quantity of pack, and in a pack we have 10 each. We also need to change the price quantity unit measure to 10 each. So it has changed the list price to be $400 per pack, and we have our bracket type set up to be quantity driven and for fixed pricing. Now one thing to keep in mind is that in the item bracket setup, the item brackets are based upon the quantity unit of measure. This is a difference from how you set up a vendor item bracket. Vendor item brackets are always set up to reference back to the Skew unit of measure, but at the item selling level, it is always based upon the quantity unit of measure. So anytime you change a quantity unit of measure, you need to make sure that you come out to the maintenance area for brackets and set this up. So right now at packet, so at one pack, we are going to have a list price of $400, and at 5 packs, $370. Let's go out now and create a sales order. And we'll input the item. Now you'll notice that initially the quantity defaults to one, and the unit of measure is based upon the quantity unit of measure that's defined at the item file maintenance area. Notice that it does come out to be $400. If I change this to 2, the price is still the same. 5, it has now changed the price to $370 per pack, and notice it is saying that it retrieved the price based upon it hitting an item bracket level. We do have the opportunity here to change the quantity unit of measure. We can go back to the each. So now those 5 packets have converted out to read 50 each, and we can also change the value here on the price quantity unit of measure to go out to each. And now that's 37, so 50 each at $37 per each. Or we can go back to our packet pricing, which is 5 packets at $370. Let's review some points regarding units of measure within Acclamare. This item has a SKU unit of measure of each. Once an item has been assigned a unit of measure and you have saved the record, you're unable to edit that SKU unit of measure. You'll receive an error message stating that the unit of measure cannot be changed once the item has been saved. Another point is that you always want to set your SKU unit of measure to be the smallest possible unit of measure that you can conceivably sell this item for. You can always set the desired unit of measure in the quantity unit of measure and the price cost unit of measure. Let's say, for example, this item had initially been set up with a SKU unit of measure of pack, and then of course the quantity unit of measure would also be pack, and its ratio would be one each. For whatever reason, you have either received a partial pack from a vendor or a part of it has been damaged where you only have 3/4 of a pack left. Yes, you could put on the sales order that you're selling 0.75 of a pack. However, you may have some price rounding issues at that point because you're now converting a 1 pack to a fractional quantity of a pack. If you're doing 0.25 of a pack or 0.50 of a pack, that's fine. But if you get into thirds of pack where you're doing 0.167, you do have some rounding issues that can come up there. While the Acclamare interface does not allow you to change the SKU unit of measure, there are some circumstances where your technical support representative can help you out. As long as the required change is simply a naming change, meaning you'd prefer EA to actually say EACH, or EA needs to say representative of piece, like PC. Your representative can go into the database itself and make a mass change to accomplish this. As that is applicable as long as the SKU unit of measure still remains basically the same core base. In other words, 10 PK equals 1 each, and 10 PK also equals 1 piece. In that case, each and piece represent the same base value of 1 as it is compared to other units of measure. However, if you decided that you'd really like to change EA to feet, for instance, and the conversion between pack of 10 to 1 would now be 5 to 1, then we cannot accomplish anything regarding that. However, as long as your SKU unit of measure remains the same base conversion value as the new value you'd like to have inserted, your technical support representative can help you out in those areas.